Hello and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. This year is packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with free and inclusive resources, events, programming, connections, and more. The 2024 conference brings you this session, Fear Factors, Horror Genre Masterclass. I'm Bradley. I will be your moderator for today's panel, and I'm here with three amazing panelists, Zamil Akhtar, Amanda B. Weaver, and Rhonda Jackson Garcia. Hi, everyone. So first off, I will give each panelist a moment to present themselves, starting with Zamil.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zamil Akhtar. I am the author of the Gunmetal Gods dark fantasy self-published series. Gunmetal Gods is, I would say, horror adjacent, but it still has a lot of horror tropes in it, especially cosmic horror. So yeah, I'm excited to be on this panel, and the series is now 4 books long, and I'm currently writing the 5th book.
Thank you. Amanda?
Hi, everyone. I am Amanda B. Weaver, formerly Amanda Ross, and I am an indie fantasy and horror author. My most recent title, No One's Gonna Take Your Soul Away, came out April 30th, and it is about a woman fighting her way out of hell with the help of a vampire, werewolf, and a demon. I'm really excited to be here. Horror is my favorite genre, and I can't wait to chat about it.
Thank you. Rhonda?
I'm Rhonda Jackson Garcia, aka RJ Joseph, and I'm a creative and academic writer, mostly writing about the intersections of race and gender in the horror genre and popular culture. I'm also the author of the Bram Stoker and Shirley Jackson Awards nominated horror collection, Hell Hath No Sorrow Like a Woman Haunted, and I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's start with the question. First of all, what do you feel are the most essential elements needed to craft a horror story? And we'll start with Rhonda.
One of the most essential things that you have to have for a story to be categorized as horror is some sort of discomfort. There's always this argument within the genre about whether something is really scary or if it's actually horrific. And because that can be so subjective, like what's scary to me may not be so scary to the next person, I think that we can kind of capture all of these stories if we focus more on the vibe. And so if the vibe is one that is uncomfortable, causes discomfort, causes some unease, I think that's the most important thing that a story would have to have in order to be categorized as horror.
Thank you. Zamil?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different elements that go into crafting an effective horror story. For me, the one I like to focus on, because I'm writing mostly horror adjacent stories, is the idea of instilling dread into the reader. And for me, instilling dread into the reader isn't always about putting a monster on the page that is really terrifying and that really that draws all the attention of the story. It's more about subtly infusing the story with ideas and with small moments that make the reader sort of take notice and basically put a chill into the reader's veins. This could be something that is just off-putting or something in the background that just seems out of place. And since I write cosmic horror, creating that sense of dread is especially important because cosmic horror isn't always about something really terrifying jumping out at you. It's all about creating dread into the reader and just making them imagine things that, are incredibly and utterly terrifying, but that might not be on the page at the present moment.
All right, thank you. Amanda?
For me, it's about 3 things. The first is cultivating a sense of tension. That is, you keep the reader kind of in the palm of your hand the entire time. I think it's also about using the setting as a character I think if we think about some of the best and most effective horror, the setting is just as important, like the camp Crystal Lake in the Friday the 13th movies or the farm in Nope. And I think the third thing is making sure that you're talking about something that is you're using horror as a vehicle to talk about something. So whether that's racism or homophobia or even something as commonplace as pregnancy and having a baby, horror really is that genre that you're able to work through the fears that we as humans have. And I think that if you do that, whether you're writing a slasher or a haunted house, it'll be very effective.
All right. So next question. How do you work at crafting intense stakes while still satisfying the reader? Zamil?
Yeah, for me in my stories, the stakes are usually moral. So it's not about the main character dying a horrible death. It might be, but for the most part, it's about the choices that the main character is going to make. Are they going to make choices that retain their sense of self as a moral, good human being, or are they going to make choices that basically cause them to descend into a more corrupt form of themselves, a form of themselves that has been defeated by the circumstances presented in the story? And I think for readers, and especially horror readers, that's very satisfying, because the horror is not just about the monster coming to kill you, but the horror is about the monster changing who you are and making you a worse version of yourself.
All right. Amanda?
I think for me, it's about pushing past your own fears first and foremost. I think that if you're not scared, you're not necessarily going to have your audience be scared. I think it's both pushing past your own fears, but all of those emotions that you might evoke, your anger, your own heartbreak, etc. Um, and then I think it's also making sure that you have peaks and valleys in the story so that you're not just keeping your reader completely tense the entire time, because that will get exhausting and they'll maybe take a break and may not come back to the story. I think to write effective horror, you need to have those peaks and valleys, add a little bit of levity or add a little bit of a bright spot or a sense of hope in it, and then that way you bring your reader down, and that way when they come back to the tension, they feel it extra hard because they just laughed or they maybe thought everything was going to be okay, and then you're telling them, nope, there's still more to deal with.
Oh, all right. Rhonda?
One of the things that I like to do to make sure that I'm writing something that a horror reader is going to want and be satisfied with is I'm always asking myself, how uncomfortable is the character? What their situation is? How can I make it worse if possible? Sometimes it feels bad sometimes to torture our characters that way, but I think it's kind of important, especially for horror. But I'm always working on my craft. So I'm always wanting to make sure I'm telling a good story first. And it's those horrific elements that actually do come secondary for me when I'm writing.
Okay, next question. What are your favorite and least favorite horror tropes? And for the latter, are there ways to improve or subvert them? Amanda?
So my favorite tropes, I would say, I love a good haunted house. I love a good possession tale. I also really love a good, standard 80s style slasher. I think my least favorite tropes would have to be the trope of the black character dying first. And I think also the bury your gays trope, where the queer characters end up being the sacrifice for their straight counterparts. I think the way to get around this is obviously to read and have more diverse voices telling these horror stories so that they are not including these tropes, but also to make sure that all of the stories, whether it's written by a white author or straight author, or what have you, include a diverse cast and that they come at it with a sense of awareness of how harmful these tropes can be. And they themselves are also working to improve them as well.
All right, Rhonda?
my favorite horror trope is that of haunted houses. I think that there are lots of ways that not only houses and objects and people can be haunted, but when you start to throw them all together, that makes for a really great horror party. My least favorite horror trope is that one that I think has sort of died down a bit. That's that one where the Black person dies first. I really hate that. So being a longtime horror fan, I've often just shaken my head at that whole thing, going, yeah, the Black people just don't make it to the end. I do think we're doing much better with that. One way that I see this handled is, first of all, that there are more than one Black character anyway, or I could even exchange that out for any character from a marginalized group, is that there is a much more eclectic group of characters nowadays. And so we don't have to worry about, oh, the Black person dies first, because there's more than one. Or we don't have to say, oh, it's terrible that, the woman is not the final girl. Well, because there's more than one. So I think that's a really good way, is to make sure that our casts are inclusive, and that there are quite a few people, so that once they start dying off, because in horror somebody probably has to die, but if your cast is very rounded out, then it doesn't feel like anybody's being sacrificed.
All right. Zamil?
Yeah, my favorite tropes are definitely all the cosmic horror tropes that are out there. I just love when the danger is emanating from something that is truly bizarre. That danger might not have a malice toward the main character. It might just it might just disregard the main character, but and the danger is coming from that sort of disregard. And I would say my least favorite trope has to be whenever a character behaves in a stupid way in a story that is sort of used to increase tension, but it's done in a way that undermines the character's intelligence. That always upsets me when I see that, because I think it's just lazy, and I think an author, to rectify that, they could just make the danger something that is actually dangerous to an intelligent person, and not just to a person who's behaving in a way that most of us would never behave.
All right. Next question. How do you feel about the line between horror and gore? Zamil?
Yeah, I think there's you can have horror without gore entirely, and I don't think the two are the same at all. But I do think gore can be used to horrific effect, absolutely. But to me, there's a very distinct line between the two. And the most effective horror that I've experienced, like I've been saying, is more of the subtle kind of horror, is more of the unsettling kind of horror. And it's not just a monster coming and ripping out people's insides. That said, the latter can also be very effective. I've some of the best horror does contain a lot of gore, and it's a very common trope for a good reason.
All right. Rhonda?
So sometimes you can have something that's horrific, that has no gore. But typically, if there is gore, then that is going to be horror. So I don't particularly care for horror where there's gore just for the sake of it, where you can tell the writer kind of went, let me just see if I can gross people out. That's kind of not my favorite read. But when the gore serves the story, I think that as writers, we'd be remiss to just leave it out if the story is telling us that this is what it requires to be told well and effectively. But they're not mutually inclusive. You don't have to have horror with gore. And so I think that I'm kind of glad that we can stay away from it if it doesn't help the story out at all.
All right. Amanda?
I think gore, much like jump scares, need to be used as a tool in service of the story, and not just something that you're using to cover up. Perhaps you don't know what to do in a scene, so you think, let's just throw some gore in there. I think it can be a very effective tool as, like I said, part of the story. For example, in my novel, no one's going to take her soul away. My main character goes to hell. And so there's gore there that correspond with the different sins because they're punishments. So there's a reason that it exists. That said, I think that there's a place for pure gore, but I think if you're really trying to tell a story that's effective, that'll be very memorable, and scare your audience beyond just making them feel a little sick, I think you need to use gore in service of the story.
All right. Next question. How does the author's mental health factor into the writing process, since we are dealing with tough, with tough subjects and stuff? Amanda?
So for me, I take my mental health very seriously. So I generally meditating regularly. I'm working out, I'm eating healthy, all of those things, so that I can make sure that I'm in the best frame of mind when I go into writing a story, because I do a whole lot of research. I go to a lot of dark places in my writing. And so I always try to make sure I take care of myself. And then beyond that, I make sure that I take plenty of writing breaks and consume content beyond just horror. I'm watching Parks and Recreation now, and I think that's been a really good salve for in between writing horror.
All right. Rhonda?
Horror is actually my comfort zone. I am that weird, dark person. I always have been since I was a child. And so it's very comforting to me to dive into a, let's say, a zombie movie, because no matter how bad things get for us in real life, because things are pretty bad at times, as you stated, Brad, but it's something where I can watch a movie with zombies and go, well, as bad as things are, there are not undead corpses chasing me. So horror kind of gives me a voice and a way to express those feelings that are not pleasant all the time. Sometimes I use my horror writing to exercise those thoughts. I write a lot of my nightmares, and I find that once I am able to write them, they often don't haunt me literally as much as they do when I have not committed them to the screen. But yeah, we deal with some heavy things, and but as it's unfortunate that the evening news is actually more horrific. And so I kind of find horror as a respite for the terrible things that happen in real life. Like, this is actually a comfort zone for me.
Thank you. Zamil?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question, because there are times when I will watch so many horror movies, one after another, that I will start to feel like depressed from just watching so much stuff that is so dismal and horrifying. And even as a writer, I will notice when I'm writing, when I've sort of strayed into a territory that is too depressing and that is just too horrific, and there's no hope left over. And that's usually a signal to me to sort of lighten things up a little bit, and to move a little bit away from the horror and to focus on something else for a little while. Because if I'm getting depressed at what I'm writing, then people who read the story are probably going to feel it the same way. And while we all love horror, and while we all do love tackling those specific emotions, it has to come, in a certain quantity, and it has to be balanced with other things so that it's digestible.
All right. So next question. How do small details like sentence structure play into a crafting or novel story? Rhonda?
So something that's really cool about horror stories is that there are so many literary devices that we can play around with, and I think that the ones that play very well within the horror genre are characterization, especially since so many times we are the monster. The way that we build those characters and show those acts of monstrosity can be really important for horror. I also think that setting is very critical to writing good horror, because you have to have a tone or an atmosphere that invites people in, while at the same time it helps them to suspend their disbelief that certain things could happen. But you also have to be able to pull them into that world, to where they will be frightened or they will be uncomfortable, where they can kind of say, well, what if this thing did happen? So I would think the characterization and setting play probably most for me in writing those types of immersive stories.
Thank you. Zamil?
Yeah, sentence structure, it's integral to the craft of writing. And when you're writing horror, especially, you have to pace your reveals. You have to sort of, structure the horror in such a way that it's effective. So it can often get very technical, when you're describing something, like if you're describing a big tentacle monster, for example. Um, how you structure the sentences and how you put in the details and which details you choose to describe. All of that can communicate horror. And if you do it wrong, it can communicate comedy, or it can communicate something you don't want to communicate. So it's something as an author that the more you write, the better you get at it, the better you understand what details to include, what to not include. And that's why, some of the best horror authors out there, you can just read like one sentence. All it takes is one sentence from them, and immediately you feel horrified. And it's because they've gained that skill through writing so much about how to convey horror, succinctly through words.
All right. Amanda?
I think it's about, as I mentioned, when varying the different horror, making the peaks and valleys of tension in your book. I think that's the same thing with sentence structure, varying your sentence structure, not having huge paragraphs every single sentence or chapter. I think that helps to create this flow state that you get into and then your reader will get into. And I think when you put them in there, it allows for your horror reveals to pack more of a punch. It allows for you to really create that slow burn, that rising tension. And I think that it's something to look out for. And I think it's something that, as an author, you should be reading horror, but also consuming other mediums, because that can help you learn how to tell a story based on the type of horror that you're writing.
All right. Next question. How do you keep your writing fresh while still creating recognizable horror? Rhonda?
Fortunately, I have been gifted with a very, very dark and seemingly endless imagination. I probably make horror stories out of stuff that don't always immediately appear to be horrific. For instance, here in class just the other week, I called one of my students by a name that wasn't his name. And it wasn't that I forgot his name. I just literally made up a whole student who didn't even exist. And so as we're sitting there, we're thinking, this is crazy, professor. We laugh about it, ha ha ha. And of course, I've turned this into a short story already. And so something as simple as creating a whole new person is me creating a whole character in a story that, of course, is not going to be as funny as it was that it happened in class. But that's usually my prospects in life. I look at things and things that happen, and my mind goes to, well, what would happen if? Or this is what we see, but is this really what's happening? And so I'm usually able to mine just regular everyday occurrences. A car accident, for instance, has instigated stories for me. Riding down a dark, 2-lane highway in the middle of the night with no other cars has instigated stories. I've literally written horror stories about almost everything. And so I'm lucky that way, in that my brain can always take the most mundane thing and turn it into something very weird and very horrific.
Thank you. Amanda?
Well, for me, I read a lot. I'm not just an author. I have a podcast, Horror Support Group. It's a book club and a podcast. So I'm kind of always consuming horror, and I'm reading it. I'm listening to an audiobook or watching a movie, TV show. But I think it's just as important to read in the genre that you're writing or consume content in the genre you're writing as it is to consume content in other genres. And that includes nonfiction, that includes documentary. I think that includes music, that includes poetry. I think it's about understanding that the world can be an inspiration and not limiting yourself just to your genre, because I think then you might start to mimic other authors or creators. I think the more that you open yourself up to other content, the more inspired you'll be and the fresher your writing will be.
Thank you. Zamil?
Yeah, I try to play with different ideas every time I write a new book. So I always try not to just regurgitate or reuse the ideas of the previous book. And sometimes I'll have a big inspiration for an idea, like the third book I wrote in the Gunmetal God series. I would say the movie Annihilation was a big inspiration for that book. But when I went to write the fourth book, I told myself, okay, I don't want to just reuse those same ideas, and I need to find like a new wellspring of inspiration to deliver the horror that I want to deliver. So often it's a conscious choice about choosing and deciding not to just take the low-hanging fruit and do what you did before. And, it's just like Amanda said, keep reading. I watch a lot of horror movies, and sometimes an idea will just spring into my mind from them. So you can't generate ideas in a vacuum. You have to interact with your genre and even outside of your genre.
Thank you. Next question. Are there any specific messages you try to send in your horror work? Amanda?
Well, I think the primary message that I send in my book, No One's Going to Take Our Soul Away, specifically, is the idea that you can save yourself and that you are valuable, worthy, and loved just as you are. And that sounds kind of weird being in a horror novel, but remember, my main character does go to hell and fights her way out. So she needs to motivate herself somehow. And she realizes that that motivation is intrinsic, that she's not going to live for anybody else or die for anybody else. Her fate is her own. And I think that that's the message that I want people to take away, is that you are worthy of being your own hero, being your own final, I'll say person, not girl, because we're inclusive here. And I think that I really want people to take that away as a reader. And I think as a writer, I think it's that you can push yourself beyond what you think is possible, and you can write that story that's been on your brain that might be weird, but there will be people out there who really love it.
Thank you. Rhonda?
I work really, really hard to center the experiences of Black females, um, uh, Black female humans, I guess I should say. And that's not that Black femininity is a monolith or anything like that. But I think that for so long, we didn't get horror stories that were told through this lens of Black femininity. And so I'd like to play with tropes that are already there because for instance, a zombie story looks different if it's written by a Black mother, if she's writing about her children turning into zombies, right? This is different from a stranger who you might be able to just dispatch of or, run away from. And so I find a lot of inspiration in these experiences that I haven't always seen. And I think that it brings a freshness to the genre, if you will, because we don't see fears through this lens very often. And so I purposely like to center those experiences.
Thank you. Samir?
Yeah, I'd say the main message in my series is that ultimately human beings are the monsters. So while I do play with a lot of concepts, like I mentioned, cosmic horror and all these and other general ideas from horror, ultimately, it's always the human beings making decisions. And for example, it could be the human being deciding to summon a monster, a cosmic horror entity into his world. to help him. But I always try to focus on the idea that it's human beings making these decisions. It's human beings who are bringing the horror, into their own lives and into the lives of others. And it's human beings that are ultimately responsible for the horror. And it's their decisions that are what make themselves, into monsters. And that the horror is not just coming from something outside of humanity.
All right, so there was other questions I had for our panel list today. So I will now give each panelist a moment to give a last bit of advice to our viewers and to plug anything they want to plug, starting with Zamil.
Yeah, I think for other writers, one piece of advice I'd give is to write short stories. That's how I got started writing horror. I wrote short stories on Reddit. And even before I wrote a novel, I was just writing horror short stories, that were 2,000 words, 3,000 words, just quick things that you can write. And especially with horror, you can communicate fear very quickly and very effectively. Whereas with other genres, can take to communicate your point, it can take a lot more words. So horror is a special genre, I feel, where a short story can be as scary as like a 300-400 page novel. So definitely that's a great way to get started writing horror. The only thing I'm here to plug is my Gunmetal Gods series. So definitely check that out. It's available on Amazon, and you can also check it out on my website, zamilakhtar.com.
Thank you. Amanda?
I think my one piece of advice for authors is just have an idea of what your definition of success is as you start. I think it can be really easy to go into this and think, I'm gonna, be a millionaire, I'm gonna do this and that is entirely possible. I think it's know what you consider to be success. That way it'll be easier to focus on your career and not focus on other people and not get jaded or consumed by, something happening for somebody else when you want it to be happening for yourself. I think for me, in terms of what I'm plugging, it is no one's going to take her soul away. If you like stories that are kind of inspired by Dante's Inferno, The Wiz, Wizard of Oz, you'll really love this book. And if you want to follow me across social, you can find me on TikTok, Twitter /X, or Instagram at Amanda B. Weaver. Always here to chat, especially about horror.
Thank you. Rhonda?
I encourage anybody that wants to write horror fiction to go for it, to try it. As we talked about earlier, fears are very subjective. Like what's frightening to one person may not be frightening to another, but at the same time, it just may be. So if it scares you, it will definitely scare somebody else. And don't be intimidated by thinking that you have to create a brand new monster. Sometimes horror works very well when it's really subtle. And so just jump out there, give it your voice and your experiences. And I think that it's worth a try if it's something that someone wants to do. I can generally be found haunting most of the social media platforms from behind at @RJacksonJoseph. So if anybody wants to take a shout out, ask me any further questions, I'm more than happy to talk with you outside of here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for watching this video. If you want to hear more about the topic, you also rewatch on this YouTube channel panels from previous years, including the horror guest of honor Gabino Iglesias from 2021 and horror social commentary from 2022. If you like the panelists will be in the Discord chat to answer any of your questions. Other than that, happy rest of your day and happy WriteHive. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.